This presentation of In Their Own Words is dedicated to the brave men and women of the United States Armed Forces. In June of 1944, after D-Day, the Allies dispatched armored forces to Europe to join the fight. The American Army's 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions were designated heavy armored divisions and were equipped with the M4 Sherman tank. The GIs hoped the Sherman was the finest tank on Earth, but in fact, the American tank was woefully inadequate when faced with the powerful gun and heavy armor of the German Panther and Tiger tanks. All too often, the Sherman was reduced to a steel coffin. Belton Cooper was a 25-year-old ordnance officer in the 3rd Armored Division, tasked with recovering and replacing battle-damaged tanks. He witnessed firsthand the deficiencies of the Sherman and even wrote about it in his aptly named book, Death Traps. Cooper first saw the Sherman while training at Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania in 1943.
When we got the Shermans in Indiantown Gap, we thought it was a good tank because it had a gun turret. None of them had ever had a gun turret before, a big gun. Then we trained with them in England. We thought they were good tanks, but we never really knew anything about German tanks. We had no information. I never saw any field manuals that told us about the German tanks. I never heard of a Panther tank. I'd read about the Tiger tanks because there'd been a newspaper that'd been used in North Africa in the Kasserine Pass, but I didn't know anything else about them. I knew about the Russian tanks. We'd read about them. But we had no direct information from the Army officially about the German tanks, about their capability, until we got into combat. It had a long barrel 90 millimeter, fired 3,300 foot-second muzzle velocity. So here we are, 2.5 inches of armor versus 3.5 to 6 inches of armor. 2,000 foot-seconds versus 3,000 foot-seconds. Difference between 2,000 foot-seconds and 3,000 foot-seconds is 4 million versus 9 million foot-pounds of energy. That's an awesome difference. The German tanks could shoot the hell out of us at any angle, any direction, anywhere, ever. The 3rd Armored Division lost 560 tanks in combat, totally destroyed. We had another 700 knocked out, which were repaired and put back into action. And that was a total of 1,350 tanks out of 232. That's a loss rate of 580%. Now, I know no branch of the military, the Air Force, the Army, anybody that took anything like that kind of loss. I remember I saw that television program recently where they said the German submarine losses in World War II was 70%. Our losses were 580%.
The 3rd Armored Division was divided into 3 combat commands, A, B, and C. Belton Cooper's unit, Combat Command B, came ashore in France 3 weeks after D-Day. Their mission was to break out through the dense hedgerow country of Normandy.
And first of all, the hedgerows themselves, I want to tell you a little about them because they are amazing. The hedgerows in Normandy, we knew nothing about them. We'd had no training, no previous idea about them, anything at all. And yet, they'd been there for 700 years. These trees would grow and hold the earth and embed themselves in the roots, and the trees would grow. And after 700 years of erosion, the earth moves away, and you have this tremendous amount of earth left. It's 10 feet thick at the base and about 8 feet high, and it's reinforced with roots and trees and everything. And it's an impenetrable thing. A tank would hit, just rear back on its back and fall over the back and be out of commission. You couldn't shoot through with a tank gun. You couldn't shoot through an artillery piece. The only way you could get through a hedgerow was with a bulldozer tank. But we only had 4 of those in division, and we lost them right away. So the Germans could see that big bulldozer, they'd knock it out. So then the only thing we had was a shaped charge. I mean, a charge, you'd have about 400 pounds of TNT, and man had to crawl up in light the fuse and run like hell and blow a hole in the hedgerow. As soon as they blew a hole in the hedgerow, the Germans would see the first tank and they'd bang it with Panzerfaust, they'd knock it out. So they'd block the hedgerow. Pretty soon the Germans got smart, and they let the tanks go through. They knew that American tanks operated with platoons of 5 each, so they let 4 tanks go. They'd block the 5th one, and as soon as it caught in the field, the Panzerfaust knocked the hell out of the rest of them. So it was a disaster. In Villers-Facade, we finally recaptured that little salient. We lost 136 men. We lost 34 tanks. and about 10 half-tracks and vehicles. So that was a terrific loss to pay for just a small salient. So that was our first experience in combat. Now, I was not there when that happened, but later when CCB got into combat, then that experience helped us a lot. So we realized we could not get to the hedgerows except by these old methods. So a smart young man named Cullen, and I don't know where Cullen was from, but I thought he was in the 2nd Armored Division. I found that he was not. He was in one of the engineer units to us. But he was no country boy. I don't know where he was from. I think somebody said he was probably from Tennessee. But he got the idea of making a hedge chopper. And the idea was very simple and very basic. And I think he got this idea from his father, who'd run a bulldozer back in a farm when he was a boy. And what he did, he took a piece of steel about 3 feet long, and he took some other steel and cut sharp spikes and let them extend out about 2.5 feet in front. So he welded up and put this thing on the toe, and the tank has these towing clevises. You could put it on there, and those spikes would dig into the hedge and keep the tank from rearing back. The inertia of the tank would just pull out the whole earth. And a tank, a Sherman, or even a medium tank or a light tank moving, say, at 3 miles an hour could take out a hedge in about 3 seconds. It'd move about 8 or 10 tons of earth. It never stopped. It just inertia of the tank would carry on. So that was awesome. Now the hedge choppers were so low to the ground that the Germans couldn't see them. They couldn't see which tanks had and which didn't have them. But once we got the hedge choppers, we could put them on a number of tanks, and we could break through 10 or 12 places at once. And the Germans didn't know where the breakthrough was coming, so that saved the day. That was a tremendous gain. And this fellow, Cullen, I don't know what kind of decorator, but he used to get the highest medal ever made because he saved thousands of lives and thousands of tanks. And that's how we broke out in Normandy, because of that hedge chopper. And then once they broke through the line, then the GHQ Tank Battalion with the infantry would hold the flanks of the line back. And when the flanks were open and secured on both sides, then the Armored Division, which was a new unit which had not been committed prior to that time, was released to go through that line, and the Armored Division would go through the line and exploit objectives in the enemy rear. Now, that was the primary purpose of the Armored Division. And the Armored Division consists of 6 tank battalions, 3 infantry battalions, 3 armored field artillery battalions, combat engineers, reconnaissance. Then it had a supply company, a maintenance company, and a medical company. So it was a completely integrated unit, self-contained. An armored division on the move in a major operation, say a 3-day operation, would take 300,000 gallons of gasoline for just one operation. So once we got into combat and started moving out, we'd move 30, 40, 50 miles a day. Once a breakthrough was made, it became what you call a breakout. And the enemy resistance, the idea was to attack enemy objectives in the rear. Like if enemy reserves were trying to come up and counterattack, if an armored division could catch them on the road before they could to dig in and form themselves, we could completely slaughter them, because the armored division had tremendous firepower. We had about 5 times the firepower of the German infantry division, and it made an awesome force. And so the armored division advanced in 6 columns, 3 combat commands, 2 columns each, and over each column we had 4 P-47 fighter planes, 24 hours a day. After the breakthrough at St. Jean, after the breakout at Operation Cobra, the 3rd Armored Division came in and went to a town called Cambron. The 2nd Armored Division swung around to the south and a place called Cirque-la-Salle, and they blocked the road between Cambron and Cirque-la-Salle. And between Rancy and Cirque-la-Salle, there was a German tank column that we caught on the road. And as I say, when we could catch them on the road before they could dig in, we had a big advantage. So they blocked the road from both ends. Then they called for the Air Force. And the P-47s came screaming in there, and they brought 8 P-47, and they came screaming in and diving and bombing. Each plane had 2 500-pound bombs and 8 50-cal machine guns, and they strafed that column and just devastated. They tore it all to pieces. That went on for about 45 minutes. So we were just waiting up at the top of the hill to finish the battle before we could go through there. After about 45 minutes of strafing and bombing, the crowds would jump out of the tanks and try to run out in the field, and the armored columns would catch them with a machine gun fire and slaughter them in the fields. When we got down to that road there were German tanks. There were about 50, I'd say between 40 and 50 German tanks, half-tracks, all kinds of vehicles scattered down the road. There were German horses pulling out. The horses were pitiful. They were shot right in the traces. They couldn't get out of the traces. So there were so many German dead and so many dead horses on that road that we couldn't drive down there. we had to get the bulls of the tanks to go through there and push all the dead bodies off the road before we get through there. It was an abject slaughter. They must have knocked out 50 tanks and probably maybe 200 men and 40, 50 horses. It was awful. That's the worst carnage I saw during the whole war. It was terrible. And so that's the way we did, by using a combination of armor, air power, and infantry working together as a team. And if we were going down a road and ran into a German roadblock, we'd stop. We wouldn't try to attack that roadblock head on. We'd stop, bring the artillery up, and they would shell the roadblock, and then our tanks could work around the flank and catch them to one side. That's how we knocked them out. During the Battle of the Bulge, we had a Sherman tank going down the road, and he had a 76 millimeter gun. That was the most powerful gun. That would fire 2,700 feet per second. He was going down the road, and he ran right smack on this Panther. And the Panther had his gun pointed down in the woods about 90 degrees away. Now, the Panther had a hand Travis. That was one disadvantage of German tanks. It was very slow to turn the turret, particularly if it was down the hill like this. But we had a power turret. We could just turn it like that. So the tank commander realized what he was up against. He knew it was going to take that German time to move that gun around to get on him. So he zapped him one time, hit the Panther, bounced off. Put in a second shot, it bounced off. The third shot, it bounced off, and by that time he had the gun zeroed in on him, the Sherman, the Panther. So he told the crew to bail out. They hit it one time and set the tank on fire. Just blew it all to hell. They hit it 3 times, and then they bailed out. He saved his crew. He lost his tank, but he saved it. They all had been dead. But when he couldn't get to that 3 times, then that was the end of it. This tank commander, who was one of the tank commanders in the 3rd Armored Division, in the letter, that his report back to General Rose, who in turn related to Eisenhower in his letter, he said, "General, in order for me to knock out a German tank, I've got to get within 600 yards and catch it on the flank. That means the side armor, where it's much thinner. Whereas a German tank can knock me out with impunity head on at 1,000 yards." So that was the thing. We couldn't even get close enough to him to knock him out before we were knocked out. And that was in an open field battle like that, we just didn't have a chance. As a result of that, we lost thousands and thousands of men. That was devastated. And so I just could not believe that there was any chance we were going to win it. I mean, that's the first time I seriously doubted if we could win this war. The Germans were just devastating us. They would just slaughter us right and left. And it just kept going on and on. It just didn't seem to stop. And I thought, what in the hell are we going to do? And so that's what happened the first tanks I saw. And then I was really shocked. And I realized that the Sherman tank was woefully inadequate. And I just didn't know how we were going to get through the war.
Initially, the Sherman tank crews consisted of 5 men. But as the losses mounted, the crew size had to be reduced.
Now, later on, we began to lose so many men that we had to operate with a 3-man crew. We had a driver and a tank commander and a gunner. And the tank commander had to do 2 things. He had to operate the radio at the same time load the gun, because the man had to cross on the other side and load it. And so we finally went with 3-man crews. Now, in one part of the book, I tell about the time during the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, it was on January the 8th, we went in the counterattack. And we got 17 tanks. Came down to the orders would bring the Army orders would bring the tanks up to us, to the maintenance battalion, and the tanks were supposed to be already had ammunition, gasoline, and everything was supposed to be ready to go. So we got the tanks, and we had to do a few touch-ups to get them ready to run and tune them up and make sure they're running. Then they brought the crews up there. Well, Major Johnson, who was in charge of the 33rd Armored Regiment maintenance, he was supposed to get the crews to me. So he sent me up 17 tank drivers, and that's all. And I said, Dick, where in the hell are these other crews? He said, Cooper, you got to get them yourself. We don't have any more crews. I said, you mean that's all you've got? He said, that's all I've got. These men can actually drive a tank. That means they've been in a tank in combat one time, and therefore they're qualified to be a driver, because that's all we had. So then they sent down 2 truckloads of raw recruit infantry. Now these guys were 17. By that time they were drafted at 17, 18 years old. They brought them down, we lined them all up. Said, how many of you guys have ever operated a tank? None of them have been in a tank. Some of them have never seen a tank before, not close up. So we divided them up, 34 men. We took 34 men out because we knew that was going to be, that would make 2 groups of 17 to operate the 3, because we knew we couldn't get 5 men. It wasn't that many men to do it. So we got them out there. So we took them and divided them into crews. And so we took a tank driver and 2 men, put them in a tank. We had good artillery. Fortunately, we had excellent maintenance sergeants and good artillery sergeants. We took those men off the side of the road, and we used armor-piercing shot so it wouldn't explode. We let each man fire 3 rounds apiece. That's the only training they had on that gun. That's all they had first time. These guys back in the States had fired hundreds of rounds back in the States. They'd been on training for 3 years, but they were all dead. And so we took them down and trained them, and about 5 o'clock that night we released them, and Major Johnson sent up crews to guide them back to the units. They went back to the units, spread out to the various companies. Going out about 8 o'clock that night, 3 hours later, out of that 17 tanks, 15 were knocked out alongside the road. And I don't know whether any of those young guys survived or not. I have no idea. I was devastated. I said, how in the hell are we going to keep going like this when we don't even have crews? The orders not only had to repair the tanks, but we had to train the crews because they had stopped training them. I was told that they stopped training tank crews at Fort Knox right at the time of D-Day, but I've been back to Fort Knox twice since then, and they denied that. They said they didn't stop training them. They said they were training tank crews, but they were going to these repl depots. That's a replacement place. And these guys didn't give a damn. They called them. The guy maybe had 3 months of training at tank school. They'd send them in infantry. They'd send them wherever they could. They didn't pay any attention to the MOS. That's what they call the rating number. What a soldier is rated for. I thought here I was 26 years old. I'd been in combat for about 6 or 8 months. I'd had some experience. I knew what these guys were getting into. They had no idea what they were getting into. And I thought, how in the hell can you send these kids? But there was nobody else to send. That was it. That's the only place we could get crews from. They had no training at all, and I don't think those guys been as the Army. I think they had to go through basic training. I think there was 8 weeks of basic training required to go before you could be sent overseas, but after that they had nothing. And it was terrible. I mean, it's just like taking a guy off the street and putting him in a boxing match with a 200-pound gorilla. I mean, it was just terrible. There was no excuse for it. But that's all we had.
Belton Cooper's unit had to recover and repair the damaged Shermans. Often, their job included the awful task of removing the dead soldiers from the tank.
Had to get the bodies out and that sort of thing, and then we'd go from there. All right, now, this was when we were enveloping the Ruhr pocket. This was in March of 1945. They brought a tank in there, which was actually shot up. It had some bodies inside, and it was it was almost an unnatural thing. It happened. I looked at the tank, and it had the gun shot off. That's the first time I ever saw a tank with the barrel shot off. Sometimes it happened, but it wasn't often. And so we tried to find out what the hell caused that. So the 2 bodies in the tank were just devastated, were torn all to pieces. And so we finally figured out, and this was a rare freak thing, and I describe it in the book, and I'm not positive this happened, but it's the best guess I could make. We figured that the 75 millimeter, it was a 76 millimeter gun. It fired at a German tank. At the same time, the German fired at it with a 75 millimeter gun. This is a freak deal. When a tank fires, once the bullet leaves the breech, the tank recoils 9 inches, and the breech opens. And then it automatically comes back and the breech closed. Was it during this period of time that the German 75 millimeter tank fired and went down that barrel tube and exploded in the barrel? And the breech was open because it hadn't had time to come back in the battery, and the blast went inside and killed the crew. And that was one of these freak damn things. That's the only thing I figured. But the barrel was blown completely once the shell exploded. It was the German shell exploding inside that blew the barrel off. And so anyway, those 2 men were just torn all to pieces. So the Sergeant Fox called for volunteers. And all these great big old rough, tough guys who was always raising hell back in England and carrying on with the women and drinking a lot of whiskey and raising hell and big cusses. You would think, hell, those guys have been the first ones to go in, and yeah, not a damn one of them budged, not one of them moved. And finally, a little tall, skinny guy, I think I called him Corporal Smith. I wasn't sure of his name, but he was a T5, but he was an instrument repairman. He was a tall, delicate guy, real skinny guy. So he stood, and nobody said anything, so this guy Smith came forward. He says, "Sergeant, I volunteer." So when he volunteered, a couple of these other guys volunteered. Now, 2 guys had tried before, and they just threw up. They couldn't do it. So he got up there. They got the shelter house out, and they got the bodies out, and they put them in separate places. They kept the body parts all together. Then once they got it out, they had to get in there with formaldehyde and wash all the inside of the tank out, because the guy's hitting the head, the brains just exploded. And some lieutenant said, Smith, why did you volunteer? You didn't have to do that. You got more important work to do and doing those instruments and everything. He said, Lieutenant, he said, I figure every soldier's entitled to Christian burial. You got to get him out of the tank to bury him. And he did. And that was an extreme act of courage. And I said in that story that courage is found in places not always on the battlefield. It took a lot of guts to do that. And that was his thinking. And he was right about it. You got to get him out to bury him.
The American Army had also developed a larger, more powerful tank, the M26 Pershing. But unfortunately, it was the Sherman that was initially chosen to be mass-produced for battle. Belton Cooper believes a clear example of how valuable the Pershings could have been was at the Battle of Stolberg in November of 1944.
All right, I'll tell you about the Battle of Stolberg. This was a month before the Battle of the Bulge took place. So, we pulled up to Stolberg. We got there in September, and by that time we ran out of ammunition, gasoline, and everything, and they stopped us cold. We were there from September, October, and November, and we finally got gasoline, rations, and ammunition, and we were ready to attack. And we were on the top of a hill, and we were going to attack down the hill, a downhill slope, which is a kind of a nebulous thing anyway. It's sometimes the people would say downhill is even worse than uphill, but I don't know. I'm not that much of a tank commander to know. But anyway, the tanks got up there, and I would go up on the hill in the daytime. We had captured a German concrete pillbox, and I'd go up there with the observer, and we'd look down the hill, and you could see these cattle down in the field all of a sudden blowing up. And I knew damn well they wasn't blowing up due to gas and stuff. They step on a mine. And so every time a cow would step on a mine, he'd plot it on the map, so he knew that the mines were in that area. So we knew about where the mines were. But the question was, how are we going to get through there? And with 2 months of rain, 2 solid months of rain, we not only had to go through a minefield, we had to go through a muddy minefield, and that's worse than a regular minefield. The Germans would actually put the mines behind their own front troops, and normally they don't do that. They only put the mines in front. But they put the mines behind their own troops, and of course their mines scattered maybe half a mile deep. They put them in that, but they put some mines in right behind their own troops where you couldn't get. You had to go through their picket line, so to speak, to get to the mines, and so we couldn't get them up at night. So that defeated us there. Well, anyway, I was up there watching, and he pretty well figured out where that minefield was and plotted on a map and everything, and turned it over to the armored troops. So in the morning of the 17th, we were supposed to attack. Now, the Battle of Hurtgen Forest and Battle of Hurtgen Forest was a brutal battle. That had just taken place in September and October. And the 4th Infantry, the 28th Division, the 2nd Division, they had lost thousands of men in that forest. It was a devastating battle. And they told us that if we assaulted through that forest again, it would take another 10,000 infantrymen's lives, that many more. Now, we knew also that, and I said in the book, that a lot of times we had to get away from the armored force tactics because we couldn't do it. And normally this would have been a job for a GHQ tank battalion to make this assault. But a GHQ tank battalion only had 3 tanks, three companies, 17 tanks each. So we've got a whole combat command. When brought them up, had 2 tank battalions. So we started in the morning of the 17th about 9 o'clock in the morning. We started first with a tremendous aerial bombardment of about 1,000 planes bombing Esweiler, which is the main city, back to the rear there to break up the communications. Then we had the tanks firing down in the field. The whole 3rd Armored Division, including the Combat Command B, which was going to make the assault, the tanks were all firing indirect fire as artillery. So that gave us equivalent about 30 battalions of field artillery shelled in this minefield in the area behind it. So then the CCB tanks lined up and started in columns, and we had 2 columns. These British flail tanks. Now, the flail tank had a big drum in front, and it had these chains, and it would swing around like this and hit the mines and try to explode them. So we had the flail tank in front of each column. They started up and they started pushing off through the column and through the minefield. The flail tanks hit a few tanks, and they'd hit a few mines and blow them up. But after a while, the horsepower to drive that flail was so much, it took power away from the tracks, and the flail tanks got stuck. As soon as the flail tanks got stuck, the Germans knocked them out and set them on fire. So then our tanks would go around the flail tank. Well, the first tank would go along maybe 30 or 40 yards and get stuck in the minefield, or maybe hit a mine. And once it got stuck and stopped, the Germans would shoot that tank till it set on fire. And finally, they would get around back. Eventually, one of the tanks would get through that minefield. Then another tank would try to follow the same tracks. Well, the tracks are so deep it gets stuck in the minefield. The result of that, we launched that attack with 64 tanks. We lost 48 and 26 minutes in that minefield. It was an absolute abject disaster. We had 64 tanks. We lost 48 and 26 minutes in that minefield. That was a disaster. That was a tremendous loss. There were tanks scattered all over the place, every direction. And some of them were set on fire. Some of the Germans kept shooting. They tried to set every tank on fire. They didn't set them all on fire, but they tried to set them on fire. So we had to go out and get those tanks. And so in the meantime, the 104th Infantry Division had been attached to us, and they were coming up to make the assault to support the tanks. Well, they came in two waves. The first wave went down forward with the tanks. And actually, out of 19 tanks, I think, in one column of 19 tanks, only 5 of them got on the objective, but there were 3 little towns, Worth, Hassett, Rath, and Serpent. There were 3 little towns down there about a mile apart, a little triangle, and that was where all the road junctions, and that was our objective, to capture those 3 towns first. Well, they got down there, but they didn't have enough infantry to hold on to them, so the tanks tried to do the best they could. So then we went out in the damn minefield to get those tanks, and the engineers had to go out, and we had to take these mine sweepers, and we had to, because we didn't get our own people blown up, we had to protect them and get them out to the tanks. Then we get these retrievers in there, and a retriever is an M3 Sherman tank without it's got an artificial gun to it. It looks like a tank, but it's a bogus gun, and it has a winch on the back, and it can pull about a 100-pound drawbar pull with a winch. We put a pulley on there. You put 200 pounds of drawbar pull. So we get to the tanks, and we try to hook up to the tanks. And sometimes the vacuum in the tank was so hard you had to get a shovel and dig it. We always worried about a mine. The mines could be in that tank. But eventually we'd get them loose, and we got them through bit by bit. But we worked all day long, and probably the next day we finally got out. I think we finally recovered all but 13 of those tanks. And we repaired, with supplies and replacements, we got enough tanks in there to get them going. Within 48 hours, we had the whole combat command up to strength. Now, the tragedy of that was this, that if we'd had the Pershing tank, which had a much wider track, and it had a 76-millimeter gun and 4 inches of armor rather than 2.5 inches of armor like we had, we'd have lost some of the Pershing tanks, but eventually they'd have gotten to, if we'd had the Pershing tanks in mass, suppose we'd had 40 or 50 Pershing tanks, some of them would have got stuck in that minefield, but the rest of them would have gotten through. We'd have gotten down across the rural. We'd got on Cologne Plain, and Cologne was only about 15 miles away. We'd attacked Cologne. This was a month before the Battle of the Bulge. If we'd attacked and captured Cologne, that was the main hub for the entire Western Front. That was the biggest supply center for the whole area. That was the actual keynote supply for the entire battle. The 3 German armies, the 6th, the 5th, and the 7th German armies were all down there being supplied. For the battle was going to take a month later. That battle didn't start until December 16th. This was a month before. If we'd gotten to and captured Cologne, the Battle of the Bulge was never taken place. And I maintain that many of the guys were there, the war would have been over right there. All right, now, I'll go back a little bit to January of 1944. In January of 44, we had a meeting in England. General Eisenhower came up from North Africa. He brought General Patton, General Bradley, General Hodges, all the Army commanders, the Corps commanders. They had a big meeting in England, a place called Tidworth Downs. And Tidworth Downs was the largest ordnance depot in Europe. That's where we kept most of our tanks and half-tracks and artillery. They had so many tanks at Tidworth Downs, you could stand up on a hill. It was kind of rolling country. That's typical English, rolling like this. You see tanks for miles and miles, and all you could see was tanks. Now, Eisenhower wanted to have this meeting because of this problem at Kasserine Pass and stuff like that. And he had been told that we now had an operational M26 Pershing tank. Instead of weighing 47 tons with 2.5 inches of armor on the faceplate and a short barrel 75 fire, 2,000 foot-seconds, this tank weighed 47 tons, another 10 tons more. It had 4 inches of armor on the faceplate had a wide track about 25 or so inches wide. It had a much longer track so that it could span greater hills, and it had much more flotation, much area per pound than the Sherman had. It had a long barrel 90-millimeter gun which fired 2,950 foot seconds. That was almost as good as the 88, but not quite. But it's the closest thing we had to it. Now, we didn't get into those tanks till after the Battle of the Bulge was over. And when we got them, we only got 10 of them. Now, going back to this thing in England, Eisenhower had this meeting, and the idea was to determine what we should do about this new Pershing tank. Would she stay with the Sherman tank, or should we go with the Pershing tank? Now, they didn't have any Pershing tanks in England at the time, but they had pictures, they had photographs of them. But they've been tested at the Armored Force Board at Fort Knox, had been tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground, they'd both been passed all their technical tests, and they were in production in the United States, but they weren't high, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, something like that, but they were actually in production. Now, at that time, the United States had this marvelous production system, and I believe, and most people believe, that if they'd said, let's go with them, we could probably had 1,000 by D-Day. But 6 months later, I mean, the American Army, once they got two of them, got something going, they could turn out tremendous quantities. I mean, it was amazing what they could do. And so, anyway, they had this meeting, and General Rose and General Harmon both served as combat commanders of the 2nd Armored Division in North Africa and in Sicily. And they'd run into these German Tiger tanks in the Kasserine Pass. They'd run into the Tiger tanks in Sicily at the beach at Gaza. And General Rose, I'm not sure he was at Kasserine Pass, but he was definitely at Gaza when they landed there. And the Germans brought these tanks that just shot the hell out of them. So he and Harmon both agreed that we needed the heavy tank. So when they showed the pictures of the heavy tank, and Eisenhower said, now what should we do? Should we get this tank going, or should we tell them to forget it? Because it's already in production. We can get a quantity. We've got a little time for it. We could get a big bunch before D-Day if we said, let's go. And General Rose and General Harmon were very much for it. They had fought the tanks. They had actually fought it. They said, yes, General, we need that heavy tank by all means. We have nothing to protect ourselves against these heavy Panther and Tiger tanks. And General Patton said, no, tanks are not supposed to fight tanks according to Armored Force doctrine. Here it was that this Armored Force doctrine come out again. Patton helped to write that doctrine. He was the ranking officer in the Army that ever served in an armored unit. He'd actually fought in tanks in World War I. He's supposed to know more about tanks than anybody. But Patton had this idea of his own. He was hard-headed. He just was opinionated, and that was the way he felt about it. And Rose and Harmon persisted that we should go to the heavy tank because they'd actually fought the tanks. Patton had never fought in a tank in World War II. He'd been too high up the line. He'd seen a tank battle, but he never actually fought one. And so they said, we need that heavy tank. And Patton said, absolutely not. Said tanks are not supposed to fight tanks. They're supposed to be fast and mobile, attack objectives, enemy real. Now, what Patton didn't know was the Pershing tank had a 550 horsepower motor. It had 16 horsepower per ton, whereas the Sherman tank only had a 400 horsepower motor, a lighter ton, but it had about 14 horsepower. So theoretically, the Pershing was a faster tank than the Sherman because its horsepower per ton it gives you. We knew it had a wider track. We knew it had a wider bearing, so it had a much better capability in muddy fields. It had a heavy armor and heavier gun. So everything was plus for the Pershing as far as compared to the German Panther tank, which was the closest thing to it we had. It wasn't quite as good as the Panther. It was the closest thing we had to it. And so Eisenhower listened to Patton, and he thought, well, Patton has had more experience than anybody. He knows more about anybody. And Eisenhower was a personal friend of Patton. They had a very close personal association. In fact, that's what kept Patton. I kept Patton on the line with all this slapping thing. He kept him going because he knew that Patton, he thought Patton was, and Patton was a good general. It was a good thing he did that. That was a smart thing to do because Patton did prove it in his courageous command of the Third Army. He did a fantastic job once the battle started in Normandy. But he was opinionated about that, and so Patton listened to Eisenhower. And so he said, he talked to Washington and said, let's downgrade the Pershing. Let's don't push that. Let's keep the Shermans coming. And that's what happened. And so the assault started that morning, and the first objective was to capture Durin, which was right on the Royal River. That was the objective. And north of the 2nd Armored Division was capture Jülich. That was the main bastion there. Once we captured these two cities, then we were supposed to converge down here and go toward Cologne. Now, the 2nd Armored really going toward Dortmund. The 3rd Armored and the 7th Corps' objective was Cologne. So we started across that area, and we had the tanks spread out. We only had 10 of them, so we had to have 5 in this combat command and 5 over here. So we had to spread them out. Every column didn't have a Sherman tank, a Pershing tank in it. But Lovelady's column did have a Pershing tank in it. And in one instant, they were going to tank, I think it's Blatzow, I'm not exactly sure, it was one of these little towns on the road between the Earth Canal and Cologne. And the Germans brought out 2 Tiger tanks and a Panther. And our tank was over the flank to one side, and it came down the damn road and knocked out a Tiger tank. It just shot the hell out of it. And me and the Germans didn't have any idea we had a tank that would do something like that. But we was deflated on one side and hit, so they knocked out a Tiger tank. That's one case I know. Then later on, as I say, in Cologne itself, and city fighting is very dangerous anyway, because first of all, the thing that you worry about in the city is people throwing stuff off the building on top, like Molotov cocktails and stuff like that, because the armor on top of the deck of a tank is thinner than it is anywhere else. And if you can throw a Molotov cocktail and set a tank on fire, that's terrible. They'd have to bail out. So we worked out a pretty slick tactic on that. We'd have a tank on the right side of the road, and would fire in the tops of the buildings in the next block, because the Krauts were always up on the top floors. When you fire the top floors and set them on fire, they run down the basement. And when they get in the basement, the infantry comes up and throws hand grenades through the basement windows, and that racks them up there. And the ones that don't run out the door, the rest don't run out the door, and then they shoot them or capture them that way. The tank over here would capture on the right side over here. So the left side would shoot the buildings on the right side, and the right side would shoot the buildings. So you'd get to where it's fairly safe. By that time, the tanks would come down there with no more people up in the top floors to drop stuff on them. Well, so it's a very slow fighting, because there's a lot of rubble in the city, and rubble's a good place to have a fortification. So we're going very slowly into Cologne, and so Clarence's tank was going up the road there, and so he was down there, and he saw this Panther tank knock out this Sherman and kill the crew. It blew it all to hell. And he saw that. So he had his camera set up, and so he runs around the corner and he sees this Pershing tank. Now, I'm not sure that Bates had ever seen a Pershing tank before, but he knew it was a big tank. And this guy, he grabs the crew. I forget the guy's name, the head of the crew, but they have, Clarence can tell you that. He said, there's a damn Panther tank right around the corner. And he said, they've just knocked out this Sherman tank, and I want you to know about it. So he told me exactly where the tank was on the map. So Smollett said he loaded his gun and put an armor-piercing shot, and he had his stabilizer engaged. You see, the stabilizer, if the tank could go up and down like there's a stabilizer, would keep it on the same level. So that meant American tanks could fire while they were still moving, while the German tanks couldn't do that. They had to stop and fire. So they thought the Americans would do the same thing. Well, Clarence comes around the corner at full speed, and he had that tank going full blast, and he had the turret going the right direction. He came right around. He was aimed right at that Panther tank. Clarence let go with the first round. It struck right at the base of the tank, which is good place, the base of the turret. The German armor is thin. It blasted down through the armor and severed the legs of the tank driver. He tried to get out of the tank, but he couldn't. And so then, as soon as Clarence stopped the tank, he puts 2 more rounds. It loaded 2 more rounds real quick, and he shot through the fighting compartment of gasoline and set the tank on fire. And I think that 2 of the men got out but were captured. The other 3 were burned up in the tank. That tank burned for 2 days, 2 solid days. Here these guys were burning up. It's just like you threw in a damn charcoal broiler. They were both on fire. You could see them, and they were naked. Their bodies were black and red and horrible looking. And I admit I cried. It just got to me. So, anyway, that night, I got to thinking about that in that foxhole. And I said, how in the hell is anybody going to survive this war? Are you going to keep going on? And so then I started thinking about the 23rd Psalm. And that something happened to me, something very strange. And I remember thinking about this part about walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
With the busy fall season just around the corner, you might be looking for wholesome, convenient meals for jam-packed days. Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit, can help you fuel up fast with chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door. You'll save time, eat well, and stay on track with your healthy lifestyle. Too busy with your end-of-summer goals to cook but want to make sure you're eating well? With Factor, skip the extra trip to the grocery store and the chopping, prepping, and cleaning up too, while still getting the flavor and nutritional quality you need. Factor's fresh, never-frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you have to do is heat and enjoy, then get back to crushing your goals. Level up with Gourmet Plus options prepared to perfection by chefs and ready to eat in record time. Treat yourself to upscale meals with premium ingredients like broccolini, leeks, truffle butter, and asparagus. With Factor, you can rest assured you're making a sustainable choice. We offset 100% of our delivery emissions, source 100% renewable electricity for our production sites and offices, and feature sustainably sourced seafood in our meals. This August, get Factor and enjoy eating well without the hassle. Simply choose your meals and enjoy fresh, flavor-packed meals delivered to your door, ready in just 2 minutes, no prep, no mess. Head to factormeals.com/warriors50 and use code warriors50 to get 50% off. That's code warriors50 at factormeals.com/warriors50 to get 50% off.
Finally, on May 8, 1945, the Germans surrendered. However, the weary American troops feared they would be shipped to the Pacific Theater and continue fighting against the Japanese.
This is one of the most dramatic things that have happened in my life. We had been down to the Riviera. We'd come back, and we had gone to Luxembourg. And there were no railroad bridges across the Rhine River at Cologne. There were no railroad bridges across the Rhine, period, at that time. There were truck bridges, but no railroad bridges. So you had to go on the train up to Luxembourg City, and in Luxembourg City you catch the trucks and go back to Darmstadt or wherever you were in Germany. So we had just come from a 2 weeks leave. We'd come back up there. We had gone into a bar and gotten a few drinks and had some good meal and everything. So the theater was open. It was just like the Alabama big theater, 3,000 palatial 1930 type palace theater. We went in there, and I'd seen the movie. It ran 24 hours a day, and it was called Betty Davis and Dark Victory. I'd already seen the movie, so I wasn't against it. But I got to sitting there thinking, we've been all through this war in Europe. We've lost all these tanks. We've lost all these men. And now we got to go back to Darmstadt. As soon as we get back there, we got to get ready to go to Marseille. We're going to go to Okinawa and invade Japan. And I thought, we've had one war. Is our chance of going to hold out in the next one? And that's what everybody was thinking. So sitting in the theater, and every once in a while he would cut the sound off and say, units of the 391st Field Artillery Battalion report down to such and such a street section to get your trucks to go back to Darmstadt. And then about 15 or so minutes they would interrupt. So this time, they not only cut the sound up, they cut the lights on and stop the theater entirely. This way they stopped the movie entirely. So everybody kind of stood up and scratched their eyes and blinked a little bit, and I was standing up and looking around. And all of a sudden, this clear voice of this Luxembourg theater manager spoke in perfect English. He said, "Gentlemen, we have just received a BBC broadcast which has interrupted a Tokyo broadcast saying the Japanese have agreed to unconditional surrender." And that was the most traumatic thing that I ever experienced I've had outside the war itself. And there were 3,000 young men who had been sitting on death row just like that. They'd been through one war, and they finally realized that they were survivors. And I'm telling you, I stood up. Some of them just fainted dead away, just collapsed, just fainted dead away, and so just fell out of the down floor. How they didn't hurt themselves, but some of them fell down on their knees and started crying. Some started praying. And that's what I did. And I was thankful that at last I'd become a survivor.
Bert Close was a 19-year-old Sherman tank crewman. During the war, he was forced to bail out of 4 destroyed tanks. He first entered combat in July of 1944.
The first battle that I was in, about July the 10th, we went through a hole in the hedgerow, and the infantry was following behind us, about 3 or 4 behind each tank. And then as the tanks would get through the hedge, they would spread out in a platoon of about 4 or 5 tanks. And on this occasion, in July 10th, the tank in front of us, I guess we probably got through a couple of fields, and one of the tank gunners hit a attic in a house that was probably several hundred yards away and just blew the attic to pieces. It could have been a place where a sharpshooter was, or a spotter was giving instructions to German artillery or something. Anyway, we went through these fields, and the tank in front of us, maybe 30 yards in front of us, was hit and it started burning. So all the crew got out of that tank, and we started backing up. And one of the, I think it was the bow gunner in the tank in front of us that was hit, stood right out there in front of our tank and gave directions with his arms, motioning the driver how to back up into the hole in the hedgerow that we had come through. And then P-47s hit that area where, and just maybe 100 yards or 150 yards in front of us, 2 or 3 P-47s came in and strafed and bombed that area and blew up what was ever there in the way of artillery, and we moved into a village. Well, the villages in France, of course, the streets were very narrow, and the buildings on each side rose maybe 2 or 3 stories above our tank. And while infantry was running from door to door, covering each other on each side of the door, on each side of the street, we were firing at the end of the street or with the 76 cannon, and I was firing machine guns. Just didn't see anybody, but just in case there was anybody that wanted to pop out, we would keep them down. But there was a place for bazooka men who could have jumped out of a window up above us and hit us with the bazooka, and there would have been no way in the world that we could have stopped that. So, in a sense, every time we got into a tank, knowing what we had already been through, we knew that it was, in a sense, a suicide mission. But nevertheless, I think each of us felt that we were rather invincible and wouldn't be hurt or killed. And that's what kept us going. I think if we felt otherwise, we would never been able to get into a tank and fight.
For several months, Close served on the crew of the greatest tank ace of World War II, Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole. Poole is credited with destroying over 250 enemy vehicles.
Lafayette Poole, when I joined the crew, was just another tank commander, another tank staff sergeant and platoon sergeant. And he had been in 3rd Armored Division and I Company of the 32nd Regiment for probably 2.5 years. Trained in Mojave Desert and in Indian Town Gap, Pennsylvania, and Camp Pickett, Virginia. And that crew had all been together, but nobody, was in awe of anybody else at that time. They all knew each other very well, and they knew their families to some extent. So Poole was just like every other tank commander and every staff sergeant when the first battle started. I didn't even know Poole or the crew when I joined them on about the 1st or 2nd of July after the first battle. And he was smart, and he was quick. He was a Golden Gloves boxer, and I'm told that he even fought a exhibition round in England with Joe Louis. So he wasn't afraid of anybody, but nevertheless he wasn't cocky. He didn't. I was a buck private, and the others were all privates or corporals. He was a staff sergeant, but he never pulled rank. Everybody knew what they were supposed to do, and they did it, and they worked together very well. So he wasn't a macho type at all. And we used to kid him, and sometimes we'd call him Lafayette, we are here, I guess the World War I veterans or soldiers did to the French soldier. And we would kid him, and of course he was always willing to take a joke. And nobody took anybody seriously, really, except when we were in the tanks and going down the road, and then things got pretty tense. The first time I was with Poole, this was his second tank. It was my first tank, In the Mood. It was a new tank. It had replaced the first tank that had been destroyed. And this was what I thought was a new tank, at least. It had new white enamel paint all inside, and smelled good and looked good, and it had a 76 gun, and I thought this was really a great tank. As we were about to start into action, and we were right on the verge of, we were probably within range of every German gun that was sitting out there, but nevertheless there was no action occurring at that time. And I had been moved up from bow gunner to the loader's position, and the loader's position was empty. Going through the German Siegfried line and the Dragon Teeth, I Company, like every other tank company, lost a lot of men and a lot of tanks, and so we were short-handed. Well, just before we were to move out, a Jeep comes up beside our tank, and a young soldier jumps out, and he's told that he's going to be the loader of In the Mood, and I'm to go down into the bow gunner seat again position. So that's what happened. I don't know how long it was after that before we really started out. It might have been 10 minutes, 15 minutes before we moved out. Well, we moved out, started going forward, along with all the other tanks, I assume. And a German shell hit our tank. It was a armor-piercing shell, and would have probably went all the way through one side and out the other. And it hit Aller in the foot, and it hit Poole in the leg. He would be standing behind Aller. And I don't know at that time whether that was a shell that also killed this soldier that had come in and replaced me in the loader's position. But I heard scrambling, and Poole and Aller got out of the tank. Well, Richards thought the best thing we can do is try and back out of range. And so he put the tank in reverse, to see if we could get it out of range of this cannon that hit us. And we probably went back 30 feet or so, and we were hit again with another shell about in the same place. And if the first shell hadn't killed the loader, the second one did. And then we went a few feet back further, and we didn't know where we were going because we had nobody to guide us, and we couldn't see. We were no way to look around, no rear view mirrors. And the tank backed into apparently a large crater, and lurched and turned over on its side, and almost 3/4 over, and upside down. And we pulled, Richards and I pulled the loader out of a hatch, but he was dead by the time we got him out onto the ground. And then German artillery started coming in, and I crawled back under the tank probably for 40 minutes or so. And then after it got stopped to some extent, I made a run for it back to see if I could get out of range, and I'm sure Richards did the same. We got back to a forward command post, and all I remember about that was that some officer was telling two men who I assume were war correspondents, that sorry that he didn't really have anything much to show him up there. And I thought to myself, boy, if you wanted to come with me, I could sure give you a story. And later on, we looked at the tank to see what had happened, and this projectile had hit the gun mount that held the cannon in place when it was going down the road, but which was flat against the face of the tank at this time. And it had hit that and been deflected and cut a gouge over the driver's hatch and sealed the driver's hatch, and then cut a gouge through the outside turret by the loader. And we discovered that after we were able to get out and look at the tank. So when we had a chance to look at the tank, and we saw what had the damage that had been done on the outside, but the damage on the inside, all of the new white enamel paint had either been shaken loose or peeled loose from that explosion. So when you consider an explosion that would knock the paint off the inside of a tank, that's a pretty good explosion. And I happened to be down on my knees looking for 76 millimeter ammunition. I thought it was a good time to start praying, but we got out of that all right. The second tank was in the mood, and that was hit with the 2 armor-piercing shells, and it really wasn't much of an explosion, and very little fragments that went when those shells hit the tank. I had a piece of just a tiny piece of shrapnel hit my lip, I guess. My lip was bleeding when I finally got out of the tank. They must have hit the turret, because that's the shells that killed the loader and then hit Poole. But those shells must have gone through the out the other side of the turret also, because they didn't bounce around inside the turret. I don't know what hit us really, whether it was a high explosive or armor piercing, but it was concussion burns rather than shrapnel that hit my face and burned my face with concussion burns, and I'm sure that's what caused the driver's blindness. So my left cheek and chin and left side of my forehead was pretty raw, and so I was sent back to the hospital after getting star blazed to the first aid station. And I was taken care of there for about 10 days or so, and sent back to the company, returned to the company, and I was looking forward to getting there because I was waiting for my mail. But by then the temperatures were down into the below zero, and I've read that they got down as low as 18 degrees below zero. And that was pretty cold on that raw face, I can tell you. At that same time, as I was going back to the replacement depot after getting out of the hospital, I met two old I Company men who had been badly burned in the first day's battle on June 29th. Badly burned. And they were in a hospital, I guess, in England. And they were being returned to the company about the 10th of January. And I couldn't believe that they would be sent back after the injuries that they had suffered. And on our first day's outing again, when I was in the company commander's tank, they were sent and put in another tank as driver and assistant driver, and they were both killed.
Close had learned the deficiencies of the Sherman tank the hard way.
My feeling towards the Sherman tanks by January of 1945 was pretty much a feeling of disgust, and it had gone from being something I really thought was a great tank until it was just a piece of junk, really. I think the problem was that the Sherman tanks, as I have since read, were designed really to fight ground troops, not German emplacements or German tanks. And my feeling was that there was no reason to use Sherman tanks in the hedgerows when they could be destroyed by bazookas at a range of 25 yards. I think the Sherman tank was inferior in both armor and firepower, but I think also the tactics that were used, the strategy of sending tanks up roads one behind the other, and trucks and half-tracks one behind the other on an icy road where there was no maneuverability, was terrible. It just seems to me that there must have been another way to have fought that battle. And I totally lost confidence in whoever was making the decisions. And I told the company first sergeant that. I was, totally disgusted both with the Sherman tank and with the people who were making the decisions on how to use them. And as I reflected back on the second and third and fourth tanks that we lost, those tanks never really fired a telling shot before they were knocked out. One way or the other, they were just sitting ducks, and they were never used to any potential. And I have to think that it was the people in command that really weren't using those tanks the way they should have been.
The key to ultimate success in World War II was improved tactics and technology, and the sheer manpower, mass production, and determination of the United States and the Allies.
There was always replacements. Although they were not trained to fight in tanks, they were there to be able to. They were there to drive them, and through sheer numbers, they were able to beat the Germans. And the same, of course, I'm sure with the armored infantry and the infantry in general. When they needed replacements, they found them. When I was going back from the replacement depot in January to my company, I met a large group of men who had been taken out of the Army Specialized Training Program in the States. They were the fellows who were going to go to college and become specialized in certain programs and never expected to see any combat. And I met them in the depot. They all had their brand new Garand rifles and new uniforms, and they were about ready to go up to the front. So it was just sheer numbers. And the Air Force, I think, did a terrific job. They saved an awful lot of tanks and tankers by strafing and bombing at various points. P-47s particularly. We got bombed out by a P-38 once, but P-47s did a tremendous job, and I think that they must have contributed greatly to the ability of the tanks to go down these roads safely and make the miles that they did laterally.
It was the end of active combat for Bert Close, but thousands of young men would follow him, and along with his contributions, they would eventually win the war. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of In Their Own Words. This program was created and produced by First Person Productions Incorporated, in association with the Documentary Broadcasting Company. Produced by David Benson. Written by Rod Pyle. Engineered by Greg Bartheld and Brian Donovan. Narrated by Bill Ratner. This production is copywritten by First Person Productions Incorporated. Any unauthorized broadcast, public performance, or copying is a violation of applicable laws.
Hello, this is Gary Chahot welcoming you to check out the French History Podcast. Our main show covers the history of France from the first humans until present. If you liked Mike Duncan's The History of Rome and wanted a similar program covering the land of beauty, culture, and love, we are exactly that. We also host world-renowned scholars who have delivered guest episodes on their specialties, including 18th century pirates, revolutionary booksellers in 20th century Paris, the special friendship between the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, and numerous others. Learn what you love and listen to the French History Podcast today.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. Thanks for sticking around. We think you'll really enjoy this next recommendation. Keep listening to discover more great content.
This podcast is a proud member of the Edify Podcast Network. Listen to thousands of Christian podcasts at edify.app. That's EDIFI.app.
This episode contains frank discussion of alcoholism and immorality and may not be suitable for younger listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi, my name is Monica. I'm from Highland Village, Texas. I'm a social worker in the medical field. I love Compelled because episode after episode is a story of God's love for us through individual lives. My family has been through some strain over the last year and a half. These stories give me so much hope and are reminders that God is there always and that His work and goodness will prevail.
0.45 is death. 0.08 is DUI. I blew 0.4. I was on the verge of dying from the alcoholism. I'm in bondage to this, mighty bondage.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, a seasonal podcast using gripping, immersive storytelling to celebrate the powerful ways God is transforming Christians around the world. Last week, our guest was Jamie Kent, who as a young child saw his entire world fall apart in just a matter of minutes. Yet as his earthly family imploded, little did he know that a heavenly Father was watching from above. Again, you can hear that story by tuning into last week's episode with Jamie Kent. Today, our guest is Stu Fullendorf, a staunch atheist and alcoholic with a tremendous success record in the marketplace. But during a booze-filled trip around the world, he couldn't shake the idea, what if God actually was real? So gather around and lean in and join us for another compelling story from the kingdom of God. Earlier this summer, I sat down with Stu at his church right outside Denver. The church is beautifully situated overlooking a valley with the Rocky Mountains in the distance, and it's about 90 minutes away from where Stu grew up in Greeley, Colorado. His parents weren't Christians, and neither was he. Maybe God existed, maybe he didn't, but what difference did it make? And by the time he reached high school, though, Stu decided he was an atheist. When Stu's parents divorced when he was 14, he threw himself into schoolwork and athletics. And while his high school friends liked to party, Stu wasn't interested. But that began to change during his freshman year of college.
I was very dedicated up to that point, and there was a dorm party. So if you talk about key points of my life, and we'll talk about why this was key. I was a freshman in college, and Dollar Bill Anderson was having a party on the floor of our dorm and said, hey, taste some of this peppermint schnapps. And I had always avoided any alcohol. In fact, I condemned people in high school that drank. And finally, I'm like, oh, okay. So I tasted the peppermint schnapps, and you know that you've got problems with alcohol right out of the chute when that was one of the key things I remember in my life is how I felt after I drank about 3 or 4 shots of that peppermint schnapps, running up and down the hall, yelling, wow, this is, almost out of control. So already seemingly a predisposition towards, a love for alcohol. And so that started my freshman year in college. And so I loved the way it felt when I was drinking. I liked alcohol to celebrate. I liked alcohol to mask the pain. It never got to a point where there was any change of how or when I would use alcohol. I just liked it. And so I was filling that empty hole in the heart a lot from about the time I was 18 years old forward, and more and more and more as the years went on. And so then sports became less important to me. And so literally alcohol really became an important part of my life. Even today, I could go, if I had a couple of martinis, I might be off to the races because I liked it. So alcohol became a bigger and bigger part of my life. And, in the world as a non-Christian, I saw it as a key aspect of my identity. Both in terms of how I was dealing with people having lunches over cocktails or with business leaders. And I don't know, sometimes I think of it a little bit like a musician that uses drugs or alcohol to write good music. It almost becomes such an integral part of who you are that's actually how it became with me. And so I was not only a functional alcoholic, I saw it as a useful tool in my life.
Just to be clear, you're going to hear a lot about alcohol in this episode, and it factored pretty heavily into Stu's life. 4 years later, Stu graduated with a degree in social sciences, and shortly afterwards met his future wife, Trish, at a bar in Colorado. They began dating and got married 11 months later. Trish got a job as an aerospace engineer in California, and Stu decided to enroll in the MBA program at the University of San Diego.
It was amazing for me. It felt like an extension of my upcoming career. We made some great friends, but I reflect back then and see, as an example, how important alcohol was even then. I know that's a central theme, but it's central because it's actually helped lead me to a greater understanding of God. And so even while my wife would work and I would go to school and pour my heart and soul into the studies. Then in the evenings, we would go out with friends and we would hang out at Pacific Beach and other things. And I would just drink till people would literally have to put me in the car, and my wife would drive home. And I was drinking way too much even then as a 25, 26-year-old, MBA student. It was just kind of an accepted behavior, if you will, again, even within the business students. Now, I think I was a bigger drinker and got drunker and some of those things more than a lot of the students did. But no, I never had anybody that I can recall come up to me and say, do you think maybe you're drinking a little bit too much? Trish will tell you, nor did she ever say that to me. She just thought it was just kind of a partying behavior. Trish was not a Christian. She would call herself a forced Roman Catholic, forced to go to Mass. Her dad went to undergraduate in law school at Notre Dame. And so there was really no talk in our house, even whether it was against God or pro God. There was really no talk in our house whatsoever, because her experience as a Roman Catholic was really quite shallow. And she didn't read the Bible. She didn't really spend any time reflecting on her own spiritual life. No, not at all. And Sundays were just a time where, as an example, we would just go out and go play volleyball or spend time together. But there was no talk of God at that time in our household.
Stu graduated from business school in 1989, and they moved back to Colorado, where Trish got another job as an aerospace engineer for Lockheed Martin. Stu, on the other hand, became the controller at a brand new casino that was opening up underneath Colorado's newly legalized gambling laws. After 2 years working at the casino, it began to wear on Stu. Not that he felt any moral compunction about the business, but watching senior citizens spend their Social Security checks in his slot machines all day long just became old and felt kind of pointless. He wanted a new challenge, and one was opening up in his hometown of Greeley. A technology manufacturing company was looking for a chief financial officer, or a CFO, and Stu got the job.
Business starts booming in 1992. Again, I remember just like yesterday, sitting in a bar at 10 o'clock at night with literally a cocktail napkin in front of me with the CEO and the founder of the company. And we're writing strategy and business plans on the back of a cocktail napkin while I'm sitting there drinking Jack Daniels. And, I happened to be, I'm working with some guys that were pretty heavy drinkers too. So I fit in perfectly. They fit in perfectly. We actually loved each other. And alcohol was a big component of that. So there's a social aspect of that too, right? Of people getting along around things that are a common worldview. None of them are Christian, all drinkers, all really smart. By 94, we were getting to the point we were growing so much that we were able to take the company public. The company boomed. I became a member of the board of trustees, the board of foundation board of the University of Northern Colorado. I'm 32 years old. I'm getting all kinds of accolades and good things happening, starting to make big bucks. So had a mahogany bar built in the basement of my house that I bought on the golf course. First thing I did was built a bar. That tells you where your priorities are. And from a worldly perspective, good things happening. By 96, the company kind of hit a plateau and brought in a new CEO. I was the head, not only CFO, but head of all corporate development. So we did 9 mergers and acquisitions in 3 years at the company. We grew from 300 employees to about 1,400 by 1998, 99, 9 different locations, 2 international. We were named the #1 public company in 1996 by the Denver Post in Colorado. And it was actually in 1996, 97 during that time period where we were kind of at the peak where we moved the headquarters to Denver from where we were in Greeley. We bought a big home up in Evergreen, Colorado. Some of your listeners won't know, but big home. My drinking habits increased and my attitude about God got more antagonistic. Again, the self-sufficiency now, and as I'm starting to gain some worldly experience and success and starting to make more money and getting stock options, I'm still not making huge money, but starting to really see the gold at the end of the rainbow here. All that happened with me is I became more self-sufficient, more prideful, and less willing to hear about God because I'm I'm becoming my own God, little g. And that's exactly where we were. And I started making enough money as a CFO then that Trish could actually take a step back. She really wanted to stay home and take care of the kids. And I can assure you, I wasn't ambivalent about that either. I wanted to be married to a professional engineer type. And the idea that she would stay home, all I could do is calculate the present value of the loss of the future cash flows of our income. And so we started having even some conflict over the fact that I wanted her to keep working and she wanted to stay home and take care of the kids.
The mixture of success at work, but strained family life at home, and Stu's constant need for alcohol wasn't getting any better. In fact, it was getting worse. And while everyone else thought that Stu was living the dream, there was one person in his life who could tell that everything wasn't as wonderful as it seemed on the outside. His wife, Trish.
So she saw me continuing to drink more and more. As I was getting more and more of what I thought I wanted, she saw me becoming more and more unhappy, which is always ironic because everything that I thought I wanted, I was getting it. And so she was really struggling with our marriage. She's like, I thought this is what you wanted, and yet you're not happy. You're drinking more and more. I don't know what I said. I don't know what to tell you.
Would you have described yourself as unhappy?
I'd say fairly angry man. Times of happiness, but fairly angry, which then helped me fit right in as a CFO, right? Willing to buy companies and, merge companies together and fire people. And at the time I would say, if you guys got a problem with firing people as we bring these companies together, I'll do it. So that's kind of where I was. And I really felt a sense of I'm getting everything I wanted, but, I don't feel joy over this. I don't feel happy. Well, when my wife went to see a pastor, church called Rockland Community Church in Golden, Colorado, Reverend Ken Williams, who just got a hold of me a few weeks ago. He's retired now. And Trish went and talked to him, to Pastor Ken, and went in with a whole list of questions and say things like, hey, if I become a Christian, can I still go to the Little Bear Bar and have some drinks? Right? I mean, things that you're like, seriously, this is what you're asking. But yeah, I mean, this is what people think about, like when they think about Christians, right? Can I still smoke a cigar? I'll come, licentiousness versus legalism. And she had all these questions, and Ken did a good job answering, said, but told her there's a women's retreat this weekend. Why don't you go to it? And Trish actually had a friend, just so happened a sorority sister of hers, who was going to that retreat. So Trish went to the retreat and was saved in really a pool of snot and tears. And so, that was, I think, 97. I think there were two things that kept us together. On my side, it was the devastation of seeing my mom married numerous times and the devastation of the pain of divorce that happened to me, with the commitment, like I really don't want to be divorced. Even then, not being a Christian, it's like, if we think the grass is going to be greener on the other side, it just isn't. And anybody who goes through divorce, you just know, I mean, it just never goes well. And then on Trisha's side, she really wanted to divorce me many times, but she never demanded it or never did, because she, and again, this is holy God in her life, really was more focused on growing in holiness and her relationship with Christ than me being her God, or her identity being around the millions of dollars that we may have had at the time. So that's kind of how she was at the time. So she wanted to get divorced numerous times, but she simply was more focused on her relationship and the Word of God. I have no doubt that even from a biblical perspective, if you talk about abandonment and other reasons to get divorced, she could have rationalized, hey, I'm not going to be married to an alcoholic. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm married to a non-believer. We were equally yoked in our non-belief before, but now we're unequally yoked. Now, in fact, at this time, Trisha's taking care of the kids. I'm probably working 60, 80 hours a week. And if I wasn't working, I was spending time at the bar or flying all over the world, flying first class. Even if I didn't have to fly first class, I'd fly first class because I got drinks in those days. I got to drink as much as I could in first class. There were times, just so you know, Paul, that I could have had a telephone call with somebody and I'd still go fly to see them, just so that I could sit in first class and drink and act like a bigwig. It was probably a year or two later when I noticed she was reading the Bible and she was going to church without me. I didn't even know she was going to church.
So did she tell you, like, hey, I became a Christian?
No. In fact, she knew that I would react pretty harshly. Again, I wasn't ambivalent, but she was definitely growing in faith. And I could see her starting to change. She had a mysterious peace about her that was interesting and actually angered me. Where things would bother her before, she wouldn't say God is sovereign, but there was this sense of God's got this, where I would get angry, like, and she would just say, hey, just calm down. Everything's good. Everything will work out. Right. Things like that, where you just start noticing. And I was noticing. and she'll tell you this, she was really focused a lot more on her own holiness than her happiness. She loves to say that her relationship with God became so preeminent in her life that happiness wasn't as important as her sanctification or her holiness. So her prayers were really around God, move in, Holy Spirit, change his heart. But for the first few years, it was like, how come you're not getting this? Why don't you know if we ever had any conversations? And then as she grew in her understanding of the word, she really started saying, hey, we need God to move in here. And that's really how her life changed more and more. And there was even a greater and greater piece as my life was spiraling out of control, more and more drinking, even as things were going well, seemingly on paper, she just kept praying, Lord, just bring him to you, bring him. And so that's how she would pray for me.
Just a few years later, Stu's frustration with life in general led him to seek out a new job as the CFO of another startup tech company, this time based in Seattle, where Stu moved his family. The company successfully IPO'd in 2000, and Stu was again awash in success and wealth. But then the dot-com bubble burst, and the company, just like many others at the time, went bankrupt.
I was drinking a lot to medicate the pain. It's like, this is the first real huge failure I felt. And now you look back, it's like everybody was floating in the same lake, but it didn't matter. It just felt like a failure. So yeah, I left as the company was unwinding and took about 6 months, and then was hired to do investment banking at a firm called Lincoln International out of Chicago. And I did that for 2 years and hated it. I wanted to be the boss. I didn't like consulting. I wanted to be the boss. So I did that for a couple of years, flying back and forth between my home in Seattle and Chicago. I would fly out like Sunday red eye, drink, fall asleep, get into Chicago on Monday morning, kick in, starting to do mergers and acquisition deals as an investment banker, and would do that for a week or two, had an apartment in River North, and I would fly back to Seattle. And I did that for a couple of years. And that's where my alcoholism really started to spiral more and more by that time. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, because it was the late night flights, time in the airports, spending time by myself in Chicago. We were going to move the family to Chicago, and then I'm not sure about that. And in all of this. And it was actually in that time period then, in 2003, after the failure and all that, where I actually went to church for the first time with my wife in Seattle.
The first time?
First time, yeah. 2003. She found a church, 2000, and absolutely fell in love. So for about 2 or 3 more years, she's like, hey, I found this church. There's a guy preaching. I think you'd really like him. We have life groups. Will you come to life groups? No, I'm not going to go to life group. I don't even know what a life group is. Community group. It's, don't even know what it is. I'm not going to go. And so finally by 2003, after the meta wave busting and being about halfway through and really, again, being really miserable, making money as an investment banker, she's like, why don't you come to church with me? And she'd ask me that. If I'm like, okay, Trish, listen, I'm not happy. I'll come to church. So that was 2003, April of 2003. So 19 years ago. And I went to church, and the sermon I heard absolutely ticked me off. The sermon was on predestination. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, I've never heard anybody preach like this, like scream and yell. And the things that he's saying about God is in control. I remember at the end of the sermon, he said, and for all you middle-aged guys out there, if you don't understand this, you're not God. And he barked about 3 times, you're not God. And I literally remember like yesterday thinking, how dare him, right, bark at me like that? And also thinking, I can't wait to come back next week to hear what he has to say. So again, I don't know what a seeker-friendly church is. I don't even know what that term is, but I know that the being barked at, something, God started wooing me. So I did. I started going to church whenever I could with Trish. I was gone about half the time to Chicago, but I'd come back and go to church with her, and about half the time it ticked me off. But the gospel was intriguing me. It was like, what do you call it? Heart softening. It was starting to like, okay, I'm interested in this. It was sort of like I was interested in atheism. So again, by this time I'm 41 years old, right? This is 2003. And I'm still reading Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and all these guys. But I'm also thinking, the deeper and deeper I get into this, the harder it is to rationalize the difficulty of understanding that there is no creator. Like, all I have to do is look at creation and understand that there's a creator. I mean, there's got to be something, right? There's some intelligence into this, seemingly, right? Unless you believe in the billions and billions to one kind of cosmic accident. But I'd never really heard a true gospel, a true Christian worldview. And then Trish asked me to go to the community group, and finally I did, and I was like the only non-Christian in the community group, and loved it. I mean, I loved the sense of community and the otherworldly feeling to the community group. There was an 80-year-old truck driver and his wife. Now I realize they were evangelizing to me, but what they're really doing is just answering questions and telling me things that got my head spinning a little bit. I remember having these conversations. So you mean from the foundations of the world that God had a plan? Like, how do we even explain eternity? Like, come on, that can't be. I have free will. And he would say things like, did you think you born yourself? Well, of course not. Well, then you really don't have free will, do you? I mean, you didn't have free will to just born yourself, did you? So, again, the answers were profound enough. So yeah, it was very intriguing to me. I remember there was a guy named Alan Artman who got up at church there talking about his drinking problems and about how his career became his identity, but now his identity is in Christ. And I remember just sitting there thinking, what in the world is he thinking about? And what in the world is he even talking about? And then he ended up becoming a good friend. I used to go to Bible studies every week with him at Starbucks. There were a few Starbucks in Seattle. So yeah, somebody that I could relate to who also was admitting to me that he was still struggling with drinking. And Trish by this time was saying, you're an alcoholic. And I remember telling her, don't ever call me that. Don't ever call me an alcoholic. Right? Pride. But I definitely was coming to terms with the fact that I was having a hard time. I remember thinking, could I go 2 days and not drink? And if I'm really honest, the answer is no. So anyway, That's what was going on.
For a year, Stu kept attending church and his community group. He was definitely not a Christian and wasn't afraid to say so. But the claims of Christ were certainly intriguing. Then in 2004, Stu was hired to be the CFO of another tech startup and manage their IPO. But if he thought the process was going to be like any other time he'd taken a company public, he was terribly wrong. This time, God was going to have a say, which you'll hear about right after the break. Just a couple months ago, I had the privilege of visiting the Masters University near Los Angeles. If you haven't heard of the Masters University before, there's a very good chance you've at least heard of their longtime president, Dr. John MacArthur, who served at the school for over 30 years while also pastoring Grace Community Church in Southern California and preaching on the Grace to You radio program. Dr. MacArthur is now the chancellor of the school and continues to be involved with the university's strategic decisions, like their choice to come back from the California COVID lockdowns as quickly as possible and resume in-person instruction and discipleship. The Masters University doesn't just care about providing a quality education for students, which they do, but more importantly, they are passionate about cultivating a deep and abiding love of Christ and His Word. Dr. MacArthur has been a trusted voice in the Christian community for over 50 years, and he and I both strongly recommend the Masters University to anyone pursuing higher education who also cares about preparing for a life of eternal influence. Learn more at masters.edu. Again, that's masters.edu. It's back to school season, and if you're like most families with children, you're running around like a crazy person trying to select the best education options for your kids. Let me suggest one of our Compelled sponsors, CTC Math. CTC Math is an innovative online math curriculum designed for K-12 students. Their lessons are intentionally concise, helping your child break down barriers and cultivate a newfound appreciation for math. And by using video tutorials and animations, they transform difficult math concepts into easily digestible ideas. Whether you're homeschooling or seeking a supplementary math tutor for personalized learning, CTC Math guarantees to be your ideal choice. And rest assured, with their 12-month money-back guarantee, you have nothing to lose. If their curriculum isn't the perfect fit for you and your family, they'll gladly provide a full refund, no questions asked. Learn more at ctcmath.com. Again, that's ctcmath.com. Welcome back to Compelled. Stu Fullendorf had been attending church and his community group for about a year now, and had engaged in some really interesting conversations about Christianity. And while he previously would have always described himself as a firm atheist, his heart was definitely softening. He was now the CFO of another tech company, and this one had some serious financial backing, including Atlas Venture, Sequoia Capital, and Kleiner Perkins, really heavy hitters in the investment world. Stu was in the process of taking the company public, which was his third time managing an IPO. The 2 weeks before an IPO frequently involve a whirlwind tour around the world to major investment hubs to meet with banks and institutional investors, which is where we pick up the story.
So we're kicking off the European leg of this. We went out to eat in London. London's a big money center. It's a big deal to get shareholders from London. And we were walking down the street, and I don't remember who it was, but one of the guys from Morgan Stanley said, "See that window up there, the one with the yellow star? That's where Marx wrote his manifesto to the Labor Party, basically his Communist Manifesto." Literally up in that window is a yellow star. It still is there if you go there. And one of the people said, kind of chuckled, like, can you imagine if communism, here we are on the IPO roadshow, right? Kind of all chuckling about it. And then one of the guys, I don't even know who, because there's probably about 8 of us in the group, said, well, he had one thing, right? That religion is the opiate of the masses, right? And then I remember our CEO, Steve Goldman, who was culturally Jewish, but a non-believer, said, yeah, that's right. And I kind of chuckled and said, yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, I agree with that. Well, then the limousine came and picked us up and took us back. We were staying at the Savoy Hotel in London. And usually I would have gone to the bar. There was a guy, Brett Goodwin, who was our head of marketing at our company. He said, hey, you want to have a nightcap? And I said, nah, not tonight. I just don't feel like it tonight. So I went back to the hotel room and just kind of sat down in this lambskin chair and started thinking about that conversation. Well, remember, this is about 3 years after I went to church for the first time, and life groups and counseling and Bible studies and all of these. And I looked at the wet bar and thought, I'll have a couple drinks. Not tonight. And then I was sitting there, and it was like I felt this wave, literally a warm wave. And I remember thinking, what would the world be like without Jesus? And I literally sat there, and I remember, just like with Jester, thinking, yeah, the world's depraved. Now I'm learning that concept. Yeah, the world's broken. But what would the world be like without Jesus Christ? And yeah, I just remember at the time thinking, I've had this all wrong. It was like a Lutheran moment for me. I was like, I can't believe how wrong I've been on this. And so I just started to weep and like, Lord, I can't believe how rebellious I've been, how wrong I've been about this. Forgive me. I believe that you're Lord. I believe you're Savior. I'm sorry. I repent. I literally started thinking about all the rebellion, and then I had this sense of like relief and the yoke lifted from my shoulders. And at the same time, I had this feeling of sin, of how overwhelmed I've been by sin in my life. And then I laid on the floor and literally just wept and wept and wept. And yeah, if somebody would have come in, they would have thought it was a complete breakdown. In many ways it was. And just wept and said, I'm so sorry. I repent. I believe. I got up, I didn't sleep, and I got up the next morning and got showered up and put my suit on. And we went to our first meeting in London. And I will remember, like it was yesterday, Barry Feidelman, who was the venture capitalist for Atlas Ventures out of Boston, was there. We happened to be in London. Maybe he was even following us around on the roadshow. And I gave my part of the roadshow pitch, right? The numbers and the graphs and all this stuff. Barry walked up to me afterwards. He's like, are you okay? Because you seem like melancholy, totally different. And I said, yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay, Barry. And I was okay, but I was certainly different.
That night in the hotel room happened 16 years ago. And Stu firmly believes that God orchestrated every event leading up to that moment. The church, the sermons, the community group, the Bible studies, and even his wife's prayers.
But there's no question that God had a sovereign plan. I mean, like the Apostle Paul, right? Who gets trained on all these languages and is going to be the high priest, and then gets knocked on his rear on the way to Damascus. And next thing you know, he's the great evangelist. If it wasn't for his prior experiences, if you will, and his killing of Christians and so forth, I don't believe deeply. We don't even have to say don't believe. It's true because it's God's sovereign plan that he would have been as effective as a church planter and evangelist and as committed as he was without going through those difficult, evil experiences that God even uses in his perceptive and decretive will, and using those kinds of experiences to lead us forward and build his kingdom. And that's good theology, by the way. And then kind of how it all sort of accumulates is we ended up being in New York for the pricing meeting right on Wall Street. And so we have where everybody gets together and say, here's your range for the IPO price is $7 to $9. I think we priced it slightly above the range because there was a big demand for the stock. I think we priced like $9.50. And that meant, I don't know, $130 million for the company of capital. And then we went out and had what's called the closing party at a dear friend of mine who's no longer a friend, unfortunately, but was a part of Solomon Brothers. And they took me to a strip club. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is just ridiculous. Because that's kind of what you did. You went out to dinner and then went to a strip club, like Scores. And I still remember sitting there thinking, man, this is like, I don't even want to do this. This is crazy. And then we got up, rang the NASDAQ bell the next morning, and the stock opened and it went from $9.50 to $23 a share on opening price. And I saved on December 7th, 2006. That's when I had my my Lutheran salvation. Pearl Harbor Day, 2006. And it was, 10 days later or so when the stock priced and started trading publicly. And so at $23 a share, I think it was like I had 12 or 15 million on paper. I can't remember. Everybody's all excited. CEO throwing high fives.
Everyone's millionaires.
Throwing high fives, right? And I remember standing there thinking to myself, this is the third time I've done this, and this is means nothing to me. And I'm not saying that out of piety or lack of gratitude or whatever, but I remember just like it was yesterday standing there thinking, this means nothing. This means nothing to me. This is the third time I've done this. And, one company went bankrupt, the other one got bought, and, blah, blah, blah. So then, everybody's all happy. And then middle of the day, we get on our G10. And so we fly all the way from New York to Seattle, where we were going to have a big party with all the employees in Belton of Seattle. The party was all set up. We were going to fly in, the executives, the 3 of us, 4 of us, whatever. We're going to talk to the employees from the balcony of the restaurant. We had the whole restaurant leased out. All the way back, though, from New York to Seattle, I remember drinking my double Tanquerays on the rocks with a twist of lemon and an onion, and looking out the window as everybody else is all happy, and everybody literally just reflecting out the window thinking, I don't even want to do this. I mean, this is crazy. I don't know where this is going to lead. I was very reflective on that. Trish came and picked me up at the Lindbergh Field, whatever. And she drove us to the IPO party because I had too many to drink even on the plane. And then we go and I give a big whooping speech from the balcony of the restaurant, and then drank way too much. And Trish sort of felt disgusted. She'll tell you this as we're driving home, and we've got 15 million on paper. And she's driving home just like rolling her eyes, just disgusted over the fact that I went to the IPO party and had too much to drink, which was a common occurrence. And and that's my salvation story. And then after that, life got really hard. It just got really hard.
The IPO was a massive success, and the company was now valued at $1.4 billion. But for once, the money, success, and business weren't on Stu's mind. Instead, God was. And now that Stu believed that God was real and that Jesus was his son, how would that change his life?
So I was afraid of what would happen. I felt a sense of joy and confusion and happiness and repentance, contrition over being 43 years old. There was a lot to work through. And again, anybody who listens to this, let me just encourage people to think that there is no normative salvation story, if you will. Of course, the normative aspect of it is when the Holy Spirit moves in and will save those who are His. But how and when we do that, that happens to us is not normative. Like, we all have different stories. In my case, though, since I was at a very high level and had just reached sort of the pinnacle of career, I was anxious and concerned about how becoming a Christian would impact me. Would it change my personality, right? I mean, I'm dealing with these things. Would it change my worldview so much that I would lose my job? Would I have the same passion? And so I did not tell Trish. Additionally, I felt a sense of guilt because I was an alcoholic. I was an addict. And so, yes, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And yes, good things started to happen. But very difficult things were part of this too. I realized that many of my worldviews were now going to change. If I were going to believe in the inerrant, infallible, and truthful Word of God, that many of the views that I had were not true. And so this is a process. I never told Trish, though. She'll tell you that within the year, she could tell that I was no longer hostile to the things I was hostile before. Again, these are the things that were like child play to me were no longer interesting to me. I was starting to become a man. And so she could see things changing, but I refused to tell her what happened because I didn't want to be committed. And I was afraid of what might happen to me. It was about 2 years later where I was finally telling somebody what happened.
You were telling someone else about your salvation experience.
Yeah, I was giving them my testimony in essence, and Trish was hearing me give my testimony, and she's like, "Is that what happened in London?" I said, "Yeah," and I've been hesitant to tell you because I wasn't sure, how this would all work out. So that's how it was. It wasn't me sitting down with Trish and saying, "I had this unbelievable experience in London and I just can't wait to get on the horse and go out and, minister to people," and all this stuff. It was, what is going to happen here? How is God going to do this? Now I was going to church every Sunday and she could tell that things were changing, and she'll tell you that.
Stu was finally out of the closet. He was a Christian and wasn't afraid to admit it. But the one thing that he was still afraid to admit publicly was that he had a serious drinking problem, so severe that it was going to push him to the verge of death. Coming up right after the break. If you're a young person, listen up. It doesn't take a pandemic to waste a year. There's a self-inflicted pandemic of young people wasting their year on overpriced educations they don't need or half-hearted attempts at working part-time jobs with an uncertain future. There is a better way to use a year. Unbound shifts the focus to building skills, gaining experience, and learning how to make wise decisions, all in the context of community. Unbound's Ascend program equips young adults just like you with the leadership training, professional skills, and network you need to launch into life. And with a job guarantee, you can be confident that Ascend will not only help you launch, but will equip you to make back your investment within a year. I personally know the team at Unbound, and they are excellent at what they do, and they're eager to meet you where you are at and journey with you to where you're headed. Learn more at beunbound.us/compelled. Again, that's beunbound.us/compelled. No homeschool parent should ever feel alone. And thankfully, BJU Press has met that need by creating a homeschool curriculum that empowers and supports parents as they educate their children. Every subject is firmly grounded in a biblical worldview and challenges children to connect classroom content with real-life problems. The BJU Press curriculum offers thorough teaching resources for parents, including videos, extra activities, and various approaches for children with different learning styles. And their Homeschool Hub is an easy-to-use online platform for parents to schedule, track, and grade student assignments easily. Want to take a family field trip or spend a few extra days studying podcasting? Not that my family would ever do anything like that. Well, now it's simple. Scheduling school has never been easier. BJU Press enables you to give your children an excellent education that flows from a biblical worldview. To learn more, visit bjupresshomeschool.com. Again, that's bjupresshomeschool.com. Welcome back. About a year after the IPO, things majorly soured, and Stu and the CEO were both fired from the company. He cashed out all of his stocks and bought a wine distributorship right as the 2008 recession hit. Stu was now a Christian, but was also a full-on alcoholic and was only getting worse.
Yeah, it was actually, and then after putting the money into the wine distributorship, the business going under, by 2008 and 9, the business was in mighty bad shape. I had put all my money in there and kept putting money in because I didn't know how long the recession was going to last. And then in 2010, I could not stay sober. It got to the point now where I would wake up in the middle of the night. I would have vodka or wine next to my bed, and I would drink just to go back to sleep again. I would get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would get a bottle of wine out of the warehouse. Just a wino and a drunk. And that's where I was, and I was suffering. So you're talking about, it used to be through celebration. I was suffering through losing my identity, through losing my money, having a hard time surrendering to God's will, having newspaper articles written, struggling mightily with pride. So one of the big things that had a huge impact on me wasn't just the Bible, but when I read, chapter 8 and section 2 of Mere Christianity about the great sin, pride. And C.S. Lewis said, pride makes all other sins seem like mere flea bites. I was struggling so mightily with my own pride. And so all of this was going on where God was purifying the gold. And finally, Trish went off on vacation without me. I went on a big bender. She got back, and I was on the verge of dying from the alcoholism.
Like alcohol poisoning.
Yeah. In fact, I'd spent the whole week just shutting myself in. I had a friend, Todd Tarberger, who came over and said, Trish told me that you may be doing this, so I'm coming over to get you. And I'm like, Todd, wild horses couldn't drag me away. And he's like, okay, you make your bed, you lie in it. Trish got back, bottles all over the place, a horror story. And she took me in. I blew 0.4. So if you don't know, 0.45 is death. 0.08 is DUI. I blew 0.4. So very close to death. And told her, I can't do this anymore. I first of all, drunkenness is a sin, but also I'm in bondage to this, mighty bondage. And so I went to rehab, and we called Lakeside Milam, and I got a bed and went to rehab. And that was September of 2010. And it was an amazing experience for me. It was a secular rehab. I had my Bible, and I checked into rehab, and they said, no, you can't have your Bible. We do the big book from AA. And I said, no Bible, no me. I'm not checking in unless I have my Bible. And they said, okay, you can keep your Bible. Well, after 5 days of detox, I started getting up and having a 5:30 in the morning personal Bible study of my own Bible study. So I had 5, 6, 7 days, just so you know, Paul, was a long, I don't know how many years it had been since I had been sober for 5 or 6 or 7 days. And I'm like sober for 5 days after going through detox. And then 7 days later, I'm starting to read my Bible. Well, then I started having people at 5:30 coming up to me. There were 96 people in the rehab center. And I remember this one guy, his name was Ken, came up and said, are you reading the Bible? I said, I am. He said, do you mind if I join you? I said, no, not at all. So after the second week, Trish would show up for the family day in rehab. And I said, there's no Bibles in here. So when you come, would you sneak Bibles in?
Smuggle Bibles into rehab.
Yeah, that's right. And so she's like, of course. So she would come with her bag, and she would give me these Bibles. Well, what ended up happening after the next 2.5 weeks is I had 19 people joining me for this 5:30 Bible study. I'm just trying to get sober, and they're joining me for this Bible study. And it was amazing. And I think I read my journal now, my diary of when I was in rehab, and I realized how profoundly impactful that was and how God was working in my life then. So I got out of rehab, and within 2 weeks relapsed, realized I cannot be in the wine business and be a recovering alcoholic. By this point, I'm saying, yes, I'm an alcoholic. Yes, I'm going to AA meetings. I'm, all of this. So after getting out of rehab, and then it was in December 3rd of 2010 is the last drink I've had. So whatever that's been now, 12 years. That was a really tough three months. But again, I would just encourage anybody who's struggling with addiction that a lot of times relapses like that are a part of recovery. It doesn't mean that your life's coming to an end. It can be the hardest time period of your own recovery is that time that you get out of rehab and then relapse. I'm not saying you have to. You shouldn't. But if you do, understand that often is a key aspect of your own recovery. So then at that point, I realized I couldn't be in the wine business. I walked away. I cashed out all my stock options. walked away from all of it. After the 2008 recession in 2010, we literally had nothing. Got sued by the Securities and Exchange Commission because of stuff that had happened at Isilon. Spent all our money on all that. And by the time it was all said and done, and I ended up going to seminary, we had nothing. We had lost all of it.
All the millions gone.
Gone, and got everything back. Because by 2011, at the end of all that, I was so on fire for Christ. I remember even sitting in the SEC trial, which is a federal trial, thinking to myself, I can't believe how connected I feel to Christ and the disciples through this as I'm being persecuted. And it just so happened that I was being accused of things that I hadn't done. I'd done a lot of things like getting DUIs and other things. But in that case, it was even more profound because I hadn't done it. And we had to even make a decision, Trish and I, about whether we would even settle out of court or go to trial. And we decided that I would go to trial over it. So all of that was profoundly transformative. At the end of the trial, I ended up not being found responsible and all this. But I say this, I didn't really care. I just was on fire for the Lord. And by the time I got done with seminary in 2014, 15, whatever, I had my MDiv and started pastoring, and here we are 7-8 years later at this growing church of God's saints and believers. And it's my story and all. It's my story.
I appreciated what you had to say, that there is no normative salvation testimony. God works in totally different ways, right? And some people are immediately saved from their addictions, and other people, God's like, hey, that's something you're going to lean into me even more to work through that together.
Yeah, like some of these that will say, I was immediately relieved of this. I'm like, praise God. Oh, that is so awesome. Yeah. And for me, it was like this kind of was grinding, longer sanctification of having to get through the issues. And I think in some ways it was very healthy because I had to work through, worldview issues and virtue issues and value issues and moral issues and theological issues. And in some ways I needed that pain, that struggling to get through that so that I could come up with what I believe God has led as a pretty deep biblical understanding of how he works.
Before we wrapped up, Stu told me one more story that I just had to share. It took place after he was saved, but before he was sober.
I was going to church, and I just had this really strong feeling that I needed to get baptized, right? Of course. I mean, it's one of the key sacraments of the church. Of course, I should get baptized. So the night before, I went to bed, and I had this unbelievably realistic dream. I and take this for what it is. It's true. In the dream, my business partner from the wine business, John Bryant, was there, and he was giving the benediction at my funeral. And I remember like hovering over my body in this dream. And at the end of the funeral, there's a bagpipe player playing Amazing Grace that comes in, and like a lot of funerals, and playing Amazing Grace. Well, again, rock and roll church. I mean, Seattle grunge music worship, right?
Not a bagpipe place.
No bagpipe players there. No. Unless they could screaming lead riffs off the bagpipes. But anyway, I get baptized at the end of the Easter service, and I'm one of, 10 or so. And then I sit down, and it just so happened at my baptism service, my dad and his girlfriend at the time were there. My kids were sitting on the other side, and Trish was sitting all the way across from me. And John Bryant, who had a disabled little girl, and his wife Elaine showed up for the baptism. And at the end of the service, I was the first one to get baptized. They baptized like 9 more. The side doors open up, and through there comes a bagpipe player walking down the middle aisle for Easter Sunday playing Amazing Grace. I'm like, this feels really familiar. This is like deja vu, to put it in paganistic terms. And then I'm like, no, wait a minute. John's here, the bagpipe player. And I leaned over, and Trish is sitting like 4 or 5 people down, and she's like looking at me like this with tears like running down her face. I'm like, oh my God. Right? I just realized that I had like dreamed this. So afterwards I went out and I'm like, can you believe that? I mean, that just blows my mind. It's the first time I'd ever seen bagpipes at church. And my daughter walks over, who was very bright, and said, of course, Dad, it's your funeral. It's your baptism. The old is dead. The new has come, right? You're dying to your old self.
As our conversation came to a close, I asked Stu one last question. What advice would he give to Christians listening to the story right now who are actively struggling with substance addiction?
I get it. I understand that it's definitely a crux of despair for you. that there's a bondage that comes from drug and alcohol use. We can be Christian and still struggling with these issues, just like we struggle with other sins. Some people struggle with their kids' performance. Some struggle with porn. Some struggle with their career. Some struggle with identity based on their balance sheet and those kind of things. Alcohol and drugs are even more profound in the sense that there is a physical addiction, and porn's like that too. I mean, there's this,
chemical.
Yeah. I mean, it literally changes the chemistry. So number one, it doesn't mean that you're not a Christian. Rest in the sovereignty and perseverance of a loving God. Having said that, in the long run, it's really important to come to terms with that, because I could not glorify God and be a drunk. So when you fall deeply in love with Christ and the Holy Spirit fills your heart, it gets to the point where the overriding desire has to be for Jesus. It has to be for the living God. And we cannot be an alcoholic or drug addict. You cannot glorify God and enjoy Him fully being in bondage to drugs and alcohol. That empty hole has to get filled with the joy of the Lord. And it's hard. You have to pray. You have to, have fellowship. You have to worship. You have to serve others. We get step 12 in AA. You have to focus your life on putting the tethers of the spiritual disciplines of Christ in place. That's why Jesus gave us the model. That will lead you to a life of sobriety. I think it's really important for those of you who are struggling out there to understand that God's hand is in it. Just give it to Him and let Him make you into who you should be and who God wants you to be.
Stu, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks, Paul.
Even as a kid, I've always been interested in business, and maybe that's why I found Stu's journey so interesting. He basically lived every entrepreneur's dream, successfully launching not one, not two, but 3 different companies on the U.S. stock exchange, and one of them with a $1 billion valuation. But what did that gain him? Nothing. In fact, he was enslaved to alcohol and his own desires and could not break free. Stu may have been in the business of making money, but fortunately for him, God is in the business of saving souls. 2 things jumped out at me. First, Trish stayed married to Stu, even though by his own admission, he was a terrible husband and father. But Trish was focused on her holiness and not her happiness, and God eventually used her life witness to bring her husband to faith. And second, Stu attended that church community group for 3 years as a non-Christian, and God used regular people in this group to begin shifting his worldview. And the members weren't all wealthy or influential or had PhDs or philosophy degrees or CFOs. They were just normal, regular people, like that 80-year-old truck driver. Today, Stu is the senior pastor at Redemption Hills Church in Littleton, Colorado. And if you're nearby on a Sunday morning, come on by. If you'd like to learn more about Stu's journey, you can read his book, Wall Street to the Well, which we'll link to in our show notes. There's a lot more to his story, and he covers it all in his book. And one of our listeners this week will win an autographed copy of his book when you enter our drawing in the show notes at compelledpodcast.com. Take 5 seconds and ask yourself, who do I know who would be encouraged by Stu's testimony? If you know someone, send it to them. You never know how God might use it. We release all of our stories for free, but they're not free to create. If you have been blessed by Compelled and you want to help us continue making more stories just like this one, then you can become a monthly Patreon supporter. Get started at compelledpodcast.com and click donate. Finally, if you're looking for a podcast app on your cell phone, then I would suggest our sponsor, CastBox. Their app is easy to use and lets you download episodes ahead of time to listen to when you're offline. And it's free. Learn more at castbox.fm. This episode was edited by Will Jackson, our sound engineer is Zach Fowler, and our associate producer is Sarah Hastings. Stay tuned for a sneak peek from next week's story with Lauren Smith, a Christian mother who felt called to adoption and foster care, but had no idea how many children God would place in her home. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll be back with another compelling story next Tuesday.
We ended up fostering about 120 children in addition to our 20 permanent children. And I think I long for the day when I go to heaven and I see the lives that God has allowed us to touch.